Welcome to the Think to Write Lab Clarity and Comparison. In this lab, we're going to take a look at what happens when we write comparisons and we don't use a lot of detail. This creates what we call vague comparisons, where there's a lot left for our reader to do. We might be hiding behind missing thinking, we might be inviting them to make assumptions, and we might be making our claim really hard to prove when we don't write with specificity in our similarities and differences. So let's get started with this lab and never write a vague comparison again. I want to talk through a few key points on this slide as we get started. We are going to be working on not only spotting, but knowing how to fix any vague comparisons. And the reason that we want to work on this skill is because as you are thinking about comparisons and writing about comparisons, we really want to be using precise criteria because that makes our comparisons so much clearer, deeper, and easier to support with evidence. So we're going to be analyzing statements to determine what's missing. We'll be looking at how we can pull in categories and specific details to strengthen our comparisons and doing a lot of analysis between those stronger and weaker statements. So let's get started. Everything that we're doing in this lab is based on this article. So you are welcome to pause the video here. I will go ahead and read the article for you to follow along if you'd like to do that. Boundaries with power. Rules and laws both shape how people behave every day. You run into them constantly at school, at work, online, and out in the community. Rules are usually created by smaller groups or organizations. Schools, teams, clubs, jobs, and even apps use rules to keep things running smoothly. Think about rules for phones during class, ID badges in the hallway, practice expectations, or what counts as late at work. These rules apply in that specific setting, and they can change fairly quickly if the group decides something isn't working. When rules are broken, the consequences are handled by the group that made them. In school, that might look like a warning, detention, loss of privileges, or sitting out of an activity. The goal is usually to correct behavior and keep the group functioning. Laws work on a larger scale. They are created by governments and apply to everyone in a city, state, or country. Students bump into laws connected to seatbelts, curfews, school attendance, and driving permits. Because laws affect a lot of people, they usually change through formal steps like discussion, voting, and approval, which takes time. When laws are broken, consequences go through the legal system. Depending on the situation, that can mean fines, community service, probation, or jail time. And enforcement involves police officers and courts. Rules and laws can also affect people differently. Age, location, access to transportation, work schedules, and family responsibilities can shape how easy something is to follow and what happens if it isn't. You also can't create a rule that collides with a law. A school can set rules for parking, drop-off, or whether students can leave campus at lunch, but it cannot make a rule that says someone can drive without a license or ignore seatbelt laws. Rules can manage a setting, but laws still apply. So now that we've read the article, we can come back to it anytime we need. It's also on future slides. But what we're going to do now is take a look at a comparison sentence. Rules and laws both shape how people act, but they do so in different ways. Okay, so what I want us to think about here is, what does this sentence actually tell us about rules and laws? What information is missing? How does vague language hide the real comparison? So pause and take time to think about and talk through those three questions. So what does the sentence actually tell us about laws? Well, we know that they're similar to rules in that they shape how people act, but we don't know the ways in which laws do that. And for that matter, we don't know the way rules do it either. What information is missing? All the details, right? We know broadly that they shape how people act, but we don't know any specifics. And that vague language really hides that level of comparison. Great. So all of this is leading to this aha moment that the sentence hints at a difference, but it doesn't really define rules or laws. So the comparison really feels incomplete. What we want you to think about is that vague comparison language replaces explanation with assumption. it puts too much on the reader. The reader has to now think about, okay, well, what are those different ways? I wish they had told me, but I've got to figure it out on my own. So we have some red flag words here for you to consider and make sure that you aren't putting these into your writing. And if you come across them while you're reading, to know that these might be hinting at a vague comparison. So here's the sentence again. Rules and laws both shape how people act, but they do so in different ways. What we want to now move into is thinking about different categories that will help us clarify the comparison. So this is where we've got these six categories for us to think through. Are we talking about purpose, what something is meant to do, its goal or reason for existing, how it functions, what its purpose is in terms of how it works, right? Or what it does in practice, the scope, who it applies to and where it applies, the process, the steps or actions used to create, change, or carry out something, authority and enforcement, who has power and how is that power used, and impact, how something affects people, decisions, or situations, like results or outcomes or consequences. So these six criteria are great for the topic at hand of rules and laws, but these categories will work for a lot of different topics that you are comparing. So come back to this slide when you are working on comparisons in the future. So here's that sentence again. Rules and laws both shape how people act, but they do so in different ways. So out of all of those categories, we go back to them here. Oops, too far. Thinking about how does that sentence relate to these, it really is about the purpose, right? What is the goal? What is the reason that we have rules and laws? Well, they are to shape how people act. So we know that that's shared between them, but we really do need to get to what's the difference? What's the purpose of rules versus what's the purpose of laws? Why do we have both? And so, as we think about what the article said, we might come up with these different bubbles to fill in the two brainstorming designs. Rules guide behaviors in specific settings or events, like a cafeteria, a skate park, a drama club meeting. They help smaller groups function. For a law, it's about setting legal expectations for everyone, like in a city or a country. They allow societies to run smoothly, safely, and consistently. So this really gets at the bigger purpose of both of them. And now, because we have these great bubbles of information, these great details, we can pull them into a revised sentence. So take a look here at these two revised sentence examples. Number one, a rule guides behavior in a specific setting, such as the cafeteria or skateboard park, while a law establishes behavior expectations that apply to society as a whole. Now it's much clearer how these two entities, rules and laws, impact behavior. Number two, the purpose of rules is to manage behavior in smaller groups, while the purpose of laws is to define legal expectations for entire communities, cities, and countries. So both of these are fantastic revised sentences that are still getting at, yes, rules and laws help guide behavior, but we're telling the specifics now to really help our reader understand how they are different. So take a minute to discuss these two questions. What details were added that made the comparison clear? And what specific words replaced vague language? All right, now we're ready to move on to practice one. So throughout the practices in this Think to Write lab, you're going to get a new sentence each time, and you're going to go through the same steps that we just walked through with the example. So the sentence for practice one, rules apply to specific situations while laws apply more broadly. Okay, what do we do with that? How do we make it more specific? So let's first go to those categories to decide which one is going to help us better come up with our comparison. So here they all are again. Here's that original sentence. Rules apply to specific situations while laws apply more broadly. What does this apply to? Is it purpose? Kinda. Function? How something works or what it does? It doesn't really talk about how it actually works. Scope? Who it applies to and where it applies? Yeah, I mean, even the word apply is in the original sentence here. So that one feels like a really good one to go with. So now that we've got that figured out, that the category is scope, Now it helps us understand that we're talking about who it applies to and where it applies. So take a moment, look in the article for what you can find about who it applies to and where it applies in terms of rules and laws. You are welcome to pause the video now to take time to go to the article and find that information. Okay. So you have your brainstorming design with what you found about the scope of rules and laws. Perhaps you have some of this information. Notice we've got some direct quotations and then we've also got some paraphrased content from the articles. So you can read about rules. They're created by smaller groups or organizations such as clubs, teams, and they apply to specific places like schools and parks. They apply to specific settings or situations. Laws basically apply everywhere and to everyone. There's some great quotations in there, and then I love the one that talks about that rules cannot supersede a law. That laws are bigger bigger rulers of the land. Okay, so once you have your details in your brainstorming design, that's the secret to now writing a much stronger comparison. So on the following slide, you're going to see examples. So I'd like you to pause the video now, think about how you can take this information and come up with a much more specific comparison sentence about the scope of rules and laws. So jot it down on your paper or turn and talk to each other and share your sentence. Pull in those bubbles like we did in the example. Okay. So maybe your revised sentence sounded something like this. The scope of a rule usually applies to one place or event, such as a cafeteria or team practice. On the other hand, the scope of a law applies across an entire community and overrides local rules. Whew, that's a whole lot of information, and it all came from the bubbles. That's the power of specificity. That's the power of using your brainstorming design to find little details that you want to pull into your sentence. Okay. So I want you to take a few moments to discuss the following two questions. What did the original sentence allow you or a reader to assume that the revised sentence forces you to define? And secondly, if someone disagrees with your revised sentence, what would they have to argue about? Okay, let's talk about some possible answers to these two questions. What does the first sentence allow you to assume? Well, specific situations for rules, more broadly for laws, you have to kind of just make that up. What is a specific situation? Is it a birthday party? Is it the city where I live? Where's a specific situation? And more broadly for laws, does that mean it applies to more people? Does that mean it applies all the time in terms of settings or literal time, 24 hours a day? Right. So the specificity that comes in into the revised sentence really helps us understand and not make any assumptions about the scope of each of these entities. And then for someone who disagrees with that revised sentence, or really in this case, two sentences, they're going to have some specifics of examples of where rules apply that are different or not in alignment with what we shared. And then the same thing for our law. So they would really have to have some very specific examples to argue against us. All right, practice 2. Rules can change easily while laws are more stable. Okay? So very first thing we want to think about is what's the bigger category here? What's the category that it belongs to, right? What are we talking about? So let's take a look at our comparison categories here and see which one fits our revision. Rules can change easily while laws are more stable. Well, scanning the headings of each of these, the category names, this one definitely falls under process. Yes, under process. The steps or actions used to create, change, or carry out something. So once we have category chosen, now you need to go and find information in the article about how a law and a rule are changed. Find details to replace easily and more stable to explain those two processes. Okay. Maybe you brainstormed information like this that we have in our bubbles. Uh, the process to change a rule can be changed more easily and frequently. A group meeting, a discussion, or a decision is really all that's needed to change a rule versus a law involves a much lengthier legal process. It affects a lot of people, so change takes time, and it's usually through formal steps like discussion, voting, and approval. Notice we have a direct quotation in here for law. Maybe you found one about rule, so you don't have to have the exact same bubbles, but if yours are similar to this, then you know you're on the right track. Okay. So take a moment to use your bubbles to come up with your revised sentence. We want to revise for specificity, for clarity, and accuracy. So pause the video here again to get that revised sentence planned out. All right. Maybe yours sounds something like this. Rules can shift frequently when a group decides something isn't working, while laws tend to change slowly through official government procedures that include discussion, voting, and approval. All right. So now that you have your revised sentence, again, it doesn't have to be identical to the example here. We want you to take a moment to do some discussion. Which version shows clearer and more precise thinking? What are the benefits of this kind of writing in informational argumentative essays? Why are they important? All right. Well, spoiler alert here as far as answering that first discussion question. Definitely our second one is much more clear and precise. And the benefits for informational and argumentative essays are truly that the more details you can give, the more defensible, right? The easier your writing is to defend, to say I'm right, you're wrong, or I've got facts, you don't, right? We want to stand on really strong writing. And so that's why writing with clarity matters so much when you are doing comparison thinking in either informational writing or in argumentative. Okay, we've got one more practice. Here's that final sentence. Rules have consequences. However, laws carry greater consequences. Okay, but still vague, right? I hope your red flag vague detector is going off because that sentence it doesn't really tell us much, right? So let's go look at the categories again. And as we think about this, it definitely falls under authority and enforcement and impact. This one has two. All right. Let's take a look now at the questions that we can now think about to help us find the details in the text. Who enforces rules and what impact does breaking a rule have? And who enforces laws and what impact does breaking a law have? So take a few moments, pause the video, find the details that help you take a look at and understand both who enforces and what the impact is of rules and laws. Okay, maybe your brainstorming design looks something like this. Right. So for our rules side, who enforces rules and what impact does breaking a rule have? Well, it might look like a warning, detention, loss of privileges, or sitting out of an activity. They are enforced by the groups that created them, like bosses or school administrators or club leaders. Versus for laws, right? Remember, they supersede rules. A rule cannot collide with a law. They vary by severity from fines, no fun, to jail time, really not fun. And it's really up to police officers and courts to enforce the consequences. Okay, take a moment, use your brainstorming design, or if you see some off of the one that we have here as the example, pull those in and now write your revised sentence. How can you take the sentence, rules have consequences, however, laws carry greater consequences, and make it a much stronger sentence? Okay. Maybe your sentence sounds something like this. Rules are enforced by the group that created them, and the impact is usually limited to that setting. But laws are enforced through the legal system, and consequences can be far more serious. All right. How did the original sentence make the comparison too simple? And why is accuracy especially important in informational and argumentative writing? Take a moment, pause the video, and discuss those two questions. All right, we've come to the wrap up part of our Think to Write lab. We have the original writing on the left, and we have a place for you to paste your revised sentences on the right. We have one sample here, and what we want to think about is the two discussion questions below. How did precision improve clarity and accuracy? Well, that's a big one to think through. And secondly, what will you do when a comparison sounds right but explains too little? So, this is really getting into that monitoring of when you are thinking more in the general statements or when you read very general comparisons, what are you going to do to really get to those detailed and more precise comparisons? Okay. So, take a moment, pause the video, read or either silently or out loud the original writing and the revised writing so you can hear the difference between these two versions of the same writing on the same topic. So I will read it now if you so that everyone can hear what the two different versions sound like. The original writing says rules apply to specific situations while laws apply more broadly. Rules can change easily while laws are more stable. Rules have consequences. However, laws carry greater consequences. Yep, very vague. I hope you are hearing just how vague that writing sounds. Versus, here's the revised one. The scope of a rule usually applies to one place or event, such as the cafeteria or team practice. On the other hand, the scope of a law applies across an entire community and overrides local rules. Rules can shift frequently when a group decides something isn't working, while laws tend to change slowly through official government procedures that include discussion, voting, and approval. Rules are enforced by the group that created them, and the impact is usually limited to that setting. But laws are enforced through the legal system, and consequences can be far more serious. Now, I hope between those two, you hear how using specific details and much more precise language helps the comparisons become clearer. There's still opportunity after all of the sentences that we wrote to give even more specificity. We could give some examples. We could pull in some direct quotations from this article or add in some additional sources. So I don't want you to think that we're finished, that this is the best it could be. But what we're showing here in this Think to Write lab is how we have to stop with vague comparisons and work on getting much more specific information so that our writing and our sentences isn't just complete, it's in depth, it's clear, it's accurate, and most importantly, it's defensible. It makes our readers say, "Oh, I like what they're saying. I agree with them." And they've stated their information or they've argued their case very clearly. Okay. So, take a moment, reflect on the writing that you've done, be impressed by how specific you made your comparisons, and make sure that you take time to discuss these two questions to ensure that you know how to bring in clarity and accuracy into your writing and to really make sure that you have that ability to listen and notice when a comparison is too vague, and now you know the steps to do to make it so much stronger. Happy writing.